Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm the Bereavement Support Lead here at Rainbows. As it's Dying Matters Week, I've invited Matt along to talk to me today. Thanks for coming. Matt is a bereaved parent, and I'd love to hear more about you and your experience.
Yeah. Okay. My experience with Rainbows started when my daughter was about 2 years old. She, to put it into context, her name was Sophie, and she died a few years ago here at Rainbows at the age of 13. And she had a condition called tuberous sclerosis, fairly rare, but not that rare, which causes abnormalities in various organs in the body, principally in her case in the brain. So she had epileptic fits all the time, and it meant that she couldn't really learn or develop very well. So she was in a wheelchair all her life, and she only had very limited communication. She could smile, and she could react to other people, and she could feed herself to a certain extent, and she could drink a bottle, but she couldn't really do very many other things. And she became, over time, ill, and when she was about 13, Rainbows got involved more directly, and we came here for end of life support. We've been to Rainbows many times over the course of her life for respite care, but I only really got to know what happened at the end of life 3 or 4 months before she died. So I remember clearly we were in Derby Hospital, and she was in for another chest infection. She had plenty of those because she would often aspirate food, having an epileptic seizure while she was drinking or eating, and that was a problem. So she had a chest infection, and it was more serious than previous occasions. And the consultant came along and sat me and Sophie's mum down and said, I think it's time we talk about going to Rainbows for end of life. And I knew it was coming, this conversation, but it was still shocking. It was still shocking because something in your brain, I think, blocks these final conversations out. And I think we went into denial during the conversation, and perhaps afterwards as well. We asked questions like, are you sure this is the case? Is there no alternative? I think we've been here before, haven't we? And the consultant was really good at answering those questions in a sensitive way, but the underlying message was probably not. Probably this was Sophie's time. And so he called Rainbows and talked about end of life care with them, and then we came to Rainbows directly from the hospital a day or so later. And I believe that not all children, need to be here, but when end of life happens, some of them go home. Sometimes they get better, but I think probably in the majority of cases, it's not like that. If end of life is talked about, that's what it means. And it took a while. It took a few weeks after we arrived for Sophie to die. And there were times during that period where she made good progress and we thought she would go home. But it was false hope and it wasn't to be.
So during that end of life period of time that you were here with Sophie as a family, what were the important times in those weeks?
Well, I suppose it was all important, but various things do stick out. We were in a room we hadn't been in before. We were given accommodation as a family as much as we wanted, and we were offered bereavement support, which was new, which was very valuable to us. And mainly, we had most of that support before Sophie died. rather than after. Although it was available, and it still is, I believe, even a few years later, if we wanted to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I remember clearly a session in this room with David, who talked to us about how to talk to Sophie's siblings about death, because that's hard. They were young at the time, so it was they were 5 and 2 years old. I remember a storybook that he gave us, which was to do with some woodland animals and how they dealt with the concept of death and dying, and that was a very useful thing. So we read that to our children, and maybe the concept was beyond them at that stage, but I think maybe it did help them. Helped me anyway.
Yeah. And if it helps you, it's going to help
Yeah.
them. And I think it's a really important point that you raise about how important it is to talk, even to children who are taking in more than probably we know, and
Yes.
to talk to them even at that young age in an appropriate way, and how I guess that helps them in the moment, but also long term.
I'm sure that's true. And I think being open with your children, your partner, and anybody else is a very healthy way to be. And it's not so easy because there is a bit of a taboo in society about talking about death at all. But when you're here in Rainbows and you have a child who is, in the last weeks of life, you can't avoid talking about it. You have to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so the more you can talk in a healthy way about how you feel and what impact it's going to have, as well as the practicality, the better.
So I think you're right. I think there is a bit of taboo in our culture around death and dying, and people feel awkward around talking about death, and they're worried. I think specifically around parents whose children have died. I think people feel especially frightened of approaching that subject and those people. What would you say to those people that will be feeling those things? What's been helpful for you?
Personally, I enjoy it when people ask me about my daughter Sophie. I like talking about her. Brings her memory alive, and I think it's helpful for me personally to do it. And I know that not all parents feel quite the same way, especially if it's a recent bereavement, very recent. And quite often, in my experience, if you ask somebody in my position to talk about their child, they want to do it. It may open some emotional floodgates for a while. It may make them emotional. But that's okay, I think.
And I think you're right. That is okay. Those feelings are valid, and it's okay. I think people feel then guilty. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to upset you. It's not necessarily their fault. They haven't upset you. Those feelings are there anyway.
They're there anyway. They're just suppressed. And I think there's two sides to this one. The person who has who's lost a child feels sometimes that they can't talk about it because they don't want to, because there's this general taboo, and because they don't necessarily want to upset the person who's with them, and the person who's with them, who's not bereaved, feels that they don't want to upset the other person. So there are two people, they're tiptoeing around each other and not knowing quite how to address the subject. An example of this is if somebody asks me how many children I've got, I sometimes don't know what to say to that. If I've just met them, I'll say 2, because I've got 2 children who are alive. But really I've got 3, but I have a child who died a few years ago. That will make them feel potentially awkward, and it will divert the conversation into somewhere where they are not comfortable for a while. And I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. At the same time, I don't want to deny that my daughter Sophie was a huge part of my life for so many years. So it's a difficult subject. It is. But my advice would always be tackle the subject. Just go in. ask the question. You might be surprised at how helpful it is.
Mm. Is there anything that you really didn't find helpful in terms of the way people were, or was there anything that was more difficult?
I'm struggling to think of an answer to that because Rainbow's handled it so beautifully. The staff are amazing. Given that, the staff had to do the job of counselling the parents, looking after the child themselves, who were maybe more aware or less aware of what's going to happen to them. Sophie didn't know, I don't think, anything about it. But also the staff themselves have emotions around this. I know. They get close to the parents and the child, and they are, to some extent, bereaved as well. So, so they did a brilliant job. But also there was real camaraderie between them and the parent, and us as parents, actually. So I think it was overall very, very positive. I feel, to some extent, a regret that I don't have the relationship with Rainbows that I used to have, because we don't come here every few weeks. We just don't need to. And I do miss that.
And I think that's interesting, isn't it? As time goes on, how you change and how your relationship with Rainbows change. But how does your relationship with Sophie change as the years go by?
I still have a relationship with her, I believe.
Yeah.
I speak to her every day. Yeah. But obviously the physical relationship isn't there. So quite a lot of my relationship with Sophie when she was alive was changing nappies and lifting her out of bed, hurting my back doing so, getting medicines together 3 times a day, going to hospital, all of that. So it was hard work. Excuse me, apart from the emotional side. It was physically hard work, and now there is no physical work at all. So in that sense, it's easier. And it's easy for her too, no matter what you think about where she is now. She didn't have an easy life. She was hard to tell, but she was in pain. Sometimes she had countless medical procedures, operations, in common with many kids who are here at Rainbows. And it used to really grieve me that we had to put her through these things. It really did. So, in a way, the relationship is better. But it's certainly different. But it still exists.
Yeah, and that's what's important, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt, for sharing your experience with me and telling me about Sophie, your lovely daughter. And it's been really good to meet you.
You too.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.